Hey everyone, thanks for joining us in this next installment of our Coffee 101 series, where we're going to spend some time talking about the different types of coffee roasters that you're commonly going to see within commercial roasting applications. Now, I specify commercial roasting applications because there are many different types of do-it-yourself or home roasting roasters that you're not going to see in a commercial setting because of size or volume or just ease of operation. So we're going to stick to those that are used in commercial applications so that you'll know what to expect when you purchase coffee from a retailer. The first type of coffee roaster that I want to discuss is called a drum roaster. And this is the kind of coffee roaster that we use primarily at Cold Blooded Caffeine. This roaster that I have on the table is our sample roaster. And all that means is that it's what we use to roast samples of new green coffee as well as smaller batches in case we need to do smaller runs or limited runs or things like that. So the reason it's called a drum roaster is that it has this big drum, and that's where the roasting takes place in this cylinder here. The coffee goes into the roaster through this port at the top, and as the coffee roasts, this drum will spin to evenly distribute those coffee beans so that they get evenly roasted. As air flows through by a fan, it's going to push the chaff or the small parchment type layer of the coffee beans out through this back and hold it in this rear compartment where you can throw it away after the roasting process is completed. Now, this drum roaster is an electric drum roaster, and it's the most efficient for this size of roaster. But once you start getting into bigger commercial roasters, you'll commonly see those roasters run on either natural gas or liquid propane. There are some large scale commercial roasters that are electric, and you're starting to see those become more popular due to the environmental impacts of natural gas and liquid propane. But as of right now, the liquid propane and natural gas are still probably the most common of the ignition sources for drum roasters. Now, this drum roaster here is capable of producing 1 kilogram of coffee per batch, and it can run about 3 batches an hour. Our larger coffee roaster that we currently have at Cold Blooded Caffeine is a liquid propane roaster that will run 6 kilograms at a time, still about 3 batches an hour. So we'll take a closer look at this drum roaster here, this 1 kilogram electric drum roaster. So here's your control panel. This is where you're going to set your temperature. You're going to control different aspects of the roast. And here, as I mentioned previously, is where the green coffee goes in and goes down into the drum. You're going to have your drum door handle here, and also you're going to have your tester here, and we use that as a way to determine at what point in the roast we are, as well as when the roast is completed. In the front here is a cooling tray, and this is going to blow cool air into it after the roast is completed. Once you lift the door and the beans fall into this tray, it's going to push cold air through it, or cooler air through it, so that the beans get back to room temperature as quickly as possible to stop the roasting process. This is the main body of the roaster. This is where the beans are going to spin in this drum. And then, as I mentioned, this is the chaff collection chamber where all the chaff or the parchment is going to collect at the end of the roasting process. And here's an example of the chaff that I was talking about. So these are just the parchment pieces of the bean that have come off during the roast process. They're really lightweight, and that's what collects in this back chamber of the roaster. The second type of coffee roaster that I would like to discuss is called a fluid bed roaster. And I know I mentioned that we weren't going to really touch on home roasters in this video, but this little guy is the only example of a fluid bed roaster that I have. So we're going to use this just as an example of how they work. And so the basic principles behind this is, instead of having that big drum that has a heating element underneath it that heats the coffee beans as it spins, this machine actually uses a heat plate in the bottom down here, and then it also has a fan in this bottom section, and it forces hot air from that heat plate using that fan up into this canister where the coffee is held. And in that process, it's heating and also turning the coffee in a similar manner to where that drum spins and moves the coffee around. So it's kind of a matter of preference as to whether you prefer a fluid bed roaster versus a drum roaster. I do really like the flavor of fluid bed roasters, the way that they're heated only by air and not by touch contact with the sides of the drum wall. I think it does make a very nice and flavorful coffee. However, for our applications, it doesn't really make sense for the volume that we roast, that we haven't found a fluid bed roaster that fits that need in our specific instances. I know there are a lot of roasters that use them, small batch roasters that use them, but we've decided to opt for the economy of the drum roaster. But a similar principle, so the air flows through from the bottom, as I mentioned, churns that bed of coffee with hot air, and then actually the chaff floats to the top because it's lighter than the coffee beans, and it collects in this collection bin over here. This particular fluid bed roaster, it's a Fresh Roast SR 800 with the extension tube on it. This is actually the first coffee roaster that I learned to roast on several years ago. So this little roaster is special to me just because it was the first roaster that I ever used. It's definitely not as technologically savvy as some of the other roasters that we use. So it's controlled by a little control panel that I'll show you in a second. But it doesn't have the capabilities of interfacing with roasting software like the previous drum roaster that I showed you does, or our big roaster that we use does. And here's just a close-up of the Fresh Roast SR 800 where you can see the chaff collector up here, and then the tube where the coffee sits, and then down here is the control panel, as I mentioned, where you can control the adjust the fan speed as well as the heating elements right here on this control panel. The heat plate is right there on the bottom, as well as the fan mechanism that pushes that air around. And the third type of coffee roaster that we're going to discuss in this video is a hybrid between the two models. This is an option that's becoming popular with a couple of major brands of coffee roasters. I don't have one here, so I'm not going to talk about it in a lot of detail because I've never really used one and I don't have an example to show you. But it is a hybrid that uses the technology of both the air fluidized bed coffee roasters as well as that drum. So that's it on commercial coffee roasters and the three main types of commercial coffee roasters available within the industry now. If you're interested in continuing to learn more about coffee in our Coffee 101 series, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss an upload. If you would like to check out our fresh roasted small batch specialty coffee, go to www.coldbloodedcaffeine.com and subscribe to our podcast, where we get a little bit informal about coffee and talk about our likes, dislikes, different aspects of the coffee industry, what it's like to be a coffee roaster within a specialty industry, things like that. And we'll catch you again for the next video. Thanks.